Hi, I'm Cher Kaufmann. I'm international artist and author of the Artful Mandala Coloring Book and the Ancient Alchemy Coloring Book. And today, I'm going to share some tips on markers. Okay, so there are a ton of different kinds of markers out there, and while I'm not going to review the way that different markers are, I'm going to show you just a few different kinds of markers, but I'm going to begin with the ones that most new colorists have access to. And a lot of times people grab the Sharpie or the Staedtler or a Sharpie pen, which is slightly different than the markers, and of course there's Crayola and Crayola markers. I want to show you a little bit about what happens with these markers. Now, this is a mixed media type of paper, so there's a little bit different than, say, a coloring book paper, but I want to show you what happens with these type of markers when they're on a mixed media type of paper, and you can see that the Sharpie goes straight through. Actually, both Sharpie markers, you can begin to see the impression of the fine, ultra fine point and the fine point both go through. They have a variety of different tips. One of the things that I want to mention is that on this Sharpie fine point here, you can see the exact point of connection and the exact point of stop, because most people, when they do their coloring, they pause just for a second, they move, and they pause just for a second, and that little second is going to create a saturation point. And so that's one of the things you want to pay attention to when you are working with markers. You'll also notice this right here with the Sharpie ultra fine point. There's a small pause where I made contact and then I moved, and I'm exaggerating this so that ball can be shown to you. What's happening is that markers by design are meant to absorb into the paper. They're either going to be a water-based or an alcohol-based, and so they absorb into the paper. And depending on what kind of brand of marker that you have, that saturation point and the fibers of the paper that you're working with, that can vary. But I'll show you this real quick here. You can combine the markers with pencils and get varying degrees of change in how this looks. So while you might like the way that the Sharpie fine point covers, you can also notice that there are lines of where I did my strokes with the Sharpie fine point. And with the ultra fine, they're much closer together. In other words, those lines become finer where they connect with color saturation as they move. And which means that I can begin to kind of hide that a little bit if I'm going back and forth. I usually don't work that way with my markers. I usually work in strokes. It keeps, my pen is going in one direction. So what I'm actually doing is I'm doing one and I'm lifting my pen and coming back and doing another stroke and lifting and coming back. And so I'm really doing my strokes in one direction, even though it may look like I'm going back and forth. I'm actually only going from left to right when I'm doing my strokes. I do want to show you this real quick. This is just Prismacolor Premier Pencil. This is what each one of these markers looks like when you go on top of pencil. This can become important if you start using mixed media in your coloring. If you decide to layer your marker and your pencil, that may be something that you want to play with, you'll notice that the color of the pencil does come through and the marker itself fills in any white of the paper. And this can be used to your advantage when you are wanting to have a full color space for your coloring effect. Okay, I want to show you one special note about a brush tip. Brush tip can go wide, it can go to a medium, and it can go to a fine tip where you're doing just the tip of it. Now this particular marker saturates pretty quickly into this paper, but what I want to show you is brush tips are a very special tool. You don't work with them the same way that you would work with other markers, because they are not meant to be pressed down on top of. You want to keep the integrity of the way the tip of this works. So if you're going to be working with the very, very tip, So say I'm going to be doing something way in the corner here. I'm actually going to create space between the pen and the paper with my hand and control the amount of pressure that I'm using. And if I am very gentle and very light with how I apply the tip of this, it's going to maintain the integrity of the tip a lot longer than someone that kind of goes and crams the tip. What happens is that the tip will begin to fray because it's not going to be holding its shape anymore. So if you're going to be using a brush tip, it's a very light touch to allow you to get into the corners of spaces. It is not a hard touch, and you want it to be something that you are really mindfully connected to, and then you can really get some really great lifespan out of the brush tip. These here, there's something about the care for these as well. You'll notice that they have what they call a chiseled tip, and so they can do wide, and they can do where you're using just the tip of it and create a thinner edge, but the same thing happens with the tip of the chisel. You don't want to be cramming your pressure onto that tip, or you're going to lose the integrity of why it is a chisel tip. So if you're going to be using the chisel tip, you want to be mindful of the amount of pressure that you're putting on the tip of the marker, and also the amount of pressure that you're putting into the paper. So if I use this here, just to show you, I'm going to use a light touch into these, I can still get into tight corners with this chisel tip, but the amount of pressure that I'm putting is very gentle, it's very light. I'm not putting enough on there to create any broken edges in this space. So I can cover a large area with the chisel tip if I use it flat, but I can also get into small places if necessary. But you want to make sure that you're holding the integrity of both ends and use the tool in a proper fashion, and it will last a lot longer for you. I want to show you how to work with pen in a way that can create interest. It kind of slows you down a little bit, which I like, because I like a colorist that is willing to spend some time with their paper. So let me show you all of the colors that I used in this space. And I also used a colorless blender. I used a little bit of a colorless blender. Now these are all different kinds of markers. I've got some Sharpie, I've got some Staedtler, I've got Crayola, I've got a bunch of different things that are involved in this. And I wanted just to show you that you can combine. I chose these because of the color scheme that they are. I didn't necessarily choose them because I was limiting it to a particular brand. I chose because of color. And that's kind of what I would hope that anybody that's moving into a creative endeavor is moving to all the supplies that they have and figuring out ways that they can move together. So here I used a basic real light Crayola, and I did some fine liner lines. And you'll notice they're kind of rough. They're just kind of little dotted lines here. And then I began to add some of my other colors. You'll notice I've got some other blues that are being added into these lines that are here. And at the very end, I'm using some green. Now, as soon as I use some green, it begins to change the overall color aspect in general. And I'll turn this so that you can see the whole thing. And then when I use the colorless blender, just to show you what it looks like, I'll do this here in the middle. Let me use this small tip. So to show you what the colorless blender looks like, if I move this in here, it begins to soften how these colors are connected. If I go to add a little bit of green, now this is going to be a little bit wet because I've just added that blender, and the blender begins to break up the bonds of the way that marker is on that paper. And this is going to look a little bit different than what that did because I did the green marker first before I did the blender. But you'll begin to see how this moves. And you'll notice it's much darker. So out of curiosity, what if I did my green here first. And again, I do it in small little strokes. Now, I think for you, I'm going to show you some of these other colors that I went ahead and added on the other layer there. And again, I do small strokes. Part of the reason why I do small strokes is that it allows for a little bit of the white of the paper to show through. In this case, I'm allowing the blue of my first layers to show through. When I do that, it gives me different dimension. Here's a little bit of the darker Sharpie. And I'm going to go back over with my original color that I used with the Crayola. This alone is going to move some of those colors to blend together. It's going to act as a little bit of a blender because it's a Crayola markers are a little bit wet and they can move the color in a slightly different way. Now if I use my blender, we'll see what happens to the color. I'm going to see a little spot here that didn't quite get enough color. I'm going to see if I can pull that color over into that space. Now, what I'm noticing is that these first ones that I did as an example, because I was moving a little bit slower and I did each layer individually with each stroke, I'm noticing that the layers I can see a little bit differently than in this space right here. I'm seeing a little bit more of a blended effect. Now let's just check the back of the paper. So you can see definitely where the marker is soaking through, but you can also see where the blender has saturated the paper, especially over in this area and in here. Now to show you a picture of a full marker paper, this is all done by Sharpie. There is all Sharpie in this one, and I want to show you that the leaves here have actually 4 different colors. There are 3 different greens and yellow, and I did it with the small stroke lines that I was describing earlier. And the petals have actually about 6 or 7 colors in there. Most people try to get up close so that they can try to see if they can find all the colors. Ideally, if you have worked with your colors in kind of a nice smooth fashion, sometimes if you overlap in smooth strokes, you won't actually see the colors. Your eye will just begin to notice that there's color variation rather than differences in markers. So just to show you, I'm going to use the back of one of my example pages here. What I mean by small strokes, just so that you can see, is that when I'm doing small strokes, I like to leave white of my paper visible. When there is white of my paper visible, that gives me more space for me to move an additional color in. So if I use a yellow, it's going to begin to change how this looks. Let's use a dark green just so you can see. But I create space for these colors to move and overlap. Now I'm kind of curious about adding a little bit of that light green back in to layer. And you'll notice then it begins to fill in some of those spaces that were not filled in from the other colors. And I have a much, much richer look than just green. Now if I want this to fill in so that it is totally more of a solid color, I can do that. I just spend a little bit more time adding my marker. If I used a, say like a Crayola marker, and I filled in this space, I can do that. But you'll notice even then, using those other colors to layer is still going to have a much richer effect. So one of the things just to pay attention to is if you use something that has a broader space, you want to watch for this little saturation point where the liquid, the wetness of your marker sometimes will leave a spot. So this is, you'll notice that stop and start. So one of the advantages that I have found with the finer the point, the less that becomes noticeable to me. And so I like to use a finer point when I'm using markers and to take my time and end up with a more interesting result than having to fight these little doodads that get left over from that stop-start position. So I want to show you when I'm working with the fine liners how you can get a soft effect, even though it looks like it starts out pretty rough. I use the fine line to create space in between. The more that I see white in between, to me that says that I still have an opportunity to continue to play with color. So if I start out with red and I add a little orange, I'm filling in some of the spaces. And here I'm filling in with yellow, but I still see some white in there. So here I went back over and I added a little bit more of my orange and my red. So to show you what this looks like, here I've got a blended color. I'm going to show you in real time how I work with, and again, I do straight single lines. I start in one direction and I go upward. I don't go back and forth when I'm working with marker this way. So if I have some orange that I'm placing and I add a pink, a bright pink, I'm just going to add it on one side. There's still quite a bit of white space, but now I'm beginning to fill this in, and I'm just going to do my small strokes, and as I move in, it's going to create more of a variation, like a vignette effect where it moves from the pink to the orange. I begin to fill in these spaces, and I can go back and I add a little bit more pink if I want. And it'll give me that solid look. But there's a different color. It's a slight, real soft movement. So even though my steps look like this, my end result can be quite soft. So for people that are used to working with thicker colors, in other words, they leave more down at one time, that's really great for creating extra color, but there's still a way to move these spaces where they are. We'll just go ahead and just play with some of the Crayola here just so that you can see. Here, I'll use a lighter blue here. And I'm doing the same thing that I did with the other one. I'm actually doing a single stroke in one direction. I may change the direction periodically to cover in an area, but I am not going back and forth. I'm going in one direction or in one direction, either from top to bottom or from bottom to top. And if I wanted to add a, let's see, here's a third blue color, just to show you a little bit of a difference here. Now, one of the problems with doing like a Crayola type marker is that the more layers that you put on your paper with this type of marker that leaves a lot initially, you may notice that the paper is beginning to change. It's beginning to get to a saturation point and beginning to ball up. So what I have found is, and I'll flip over so that you can see, it's not necessarily coming through, but I can actually see there's a wet indentation here. You won't be able to see it, but I can actually feel there's a wet indentation, which means that this is almost at its saturation point and it's begin to release the fibers of the paper. I don't get the same effect when I'm using smaller strokes with finer tips. They don't saturate the paper as quickly, and I can use a finer touch to create a color variation from one side to another side quite easily. I can layer a whole bunch of colors on here, but it's only a matter of time where the paper can't take anymore. So I encourage people to play with some of these finer tips. Now, just out of curiosity, I'm going to go ahead and add a little bit of yellow on this other side just to create a highlight, just so that you can begin to see a little bit of that change a little bit differently. And it doesn't take much. It just takes a little patience, and it's a different way to connect with your paper and your pen, because your pens are tools. And every time you change to a different marker or a different pen, you have to work with the way that tool works. So there's a different way to maybe approach how to work with markers, is instead of saturating your page, is maybe to work with layers. Images from today were from the Artful Mandala Coloring Book, Creative Designs for Fun and Meditation, and also from the Ancient Alchemy Coloring Book, Celtic Knots, Mandalas, and Sacred Symbols. Thank you for joining me. I'm Cher Kaufmann. Until next time, from the drawing desk, may you find more color in your day.